You read that title correctly. Today I'm editing your photos. Not my photos, your photos. This is definitely a bit different than the normal content you'd see on this channel, but today we're flipping the script and it's gonna be a ton of fun, so let's get into it. Recently, I put out a post on Instagram inviting all of you to submit some of your favorite unedited photos for me to edit in a video just like this. A lot of you submitted some really great photos, and you'll see a few of them today. But if you'd like to submit a photo for a future editing your photos video, go ahead and send your raw photos to zsphotoedits@gmail.com. Make sure to tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how long have you been shooting, and don't forget to leave your Instagram handle so that way if you're featured in a future video, I can give you a shout out. But like I said, we got some great raw photos to get into for this episode, so let's go ahead and get into editing. Okay, our first two photos come from Kevin Hellhake, who is a photographer outside of Atlanta, Georgia, and obviously he takes some pretty spectacular portraits. Let's check out this first raw image. And boom, getting into this first portrait looks absolutely incredible. I almost don't need to edit it, but we're gonna edit it because that's the point of this video. So I brought this raw into Lightroom, and the first thing I did was brighten things up, drop the highlights, that way we can keep some of that detail while also raising the shadows so we can see more of her face. Brought up some of the whites, dropped the blacks so that way we can get some nice contrast. Then the next thing that I did was bring up the clarity and the dehaze sliders. These are two sliders that are probably used more than any other sliders inside of Lightroom. If you want to learn why, I did do a video about these two sliders. Really helps to make your image pop. Then we hop down to the tone curve so I can mess a bit more with the contrast in the midtones specifically. Hopping down to the HSL panel, mess around with the reds, oranges, and yellows because red and orange are in the skin, and then yellow is obviously yellow hair. We've got the yellow top that she's wearing, so I wanted to mess around with the hue and push it a little bit more towards the warmer tones. Then mess with the saturation, drop things down a little bit. A lot of times I just mess around with those sliders so that way I can see where things are being affected in the image. Sometimes if there's not a certain tone, then it's not going to do much, but then otherwise you can get a good idea of what part of the image is being affected whenever you're messing around with those HSL sliders. Then I went over to the luminance panel and I started messing around with more of those warm tones. That way I can make certain things pop and I can subdue other colors. The next thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to clean up a little bit of her lips. It looks like it might have been a little bit of dry out when they were shooting, or possibly she was a bit dehydrated when she was getting this photo taken of her. So I wanted to go ahead and clean up that because it's a beautiful photo. So I went in and used the spot removal tool and I used the heel setting, and I basically went through every single spot here where I could correct where the dead skin was and made things look a bit more soft. Now her lips are looking much more natural, much smoother. Next thing is I hopped down to the camera calibration sliders and I started messing around to see where we could shift some of the tones, make things pop a little bit more in certain areas and subdue other colors. Went back to the exposure and I messed around a little bit more to see if I can get things popping a little bit extra, and then warm things up with the white balance tool to again make things a little bit warmer. Here is where we ended up with the edit. I brightened things up a bit more, made it a bit more punchy, contrasty, and leaned it towards the warmer tones to get more of that kind of summery to autumn type of vibe. Really love this photo. Kevin, hope you enjoyed the edit. We got our second photo here from Kevin. It's another beautiful portrait. Looks like it was shot underneath some sort of a bridge. Maybe it was at a skate park or something. It's got that cool graffiti, kind of like grungy vibes, and I'm excited to edit this photo. First thing, go into the exposure, make things a bit brighter, and make sure that we're getting the details. It looks like the light was coming from a very specific direction on the right side of her, so I wanted to make sure that we're getting that nice bright light because it was very soft. Bumped up the vibrance so that way we can get some more details in those beautiful colors. Went into the tone curve, started making some adjustments again to just get that nice contrast, making sure that everything is at a nice exposure level before messing with our colors. Then dropped down to the HSL panel and I started messing around with hue, saturation, and luminance just to see what kind of play I had in this image to start pushing colors in a certain direction. Since we have a lot of colors around our subject, I wanted to make sure that nothing was popping out too much, so I brought down the saturation quite a bit in a few of these areas. Went down to the color grading and I wanted to do more of a teal and orange kind of look, so I brought the orange up in the midtones, I added some cooler bluish teals in the shadows, and then I added more warm tones into the highlights to mess with the balance and the blending so that I can get it just the way I want it. Then I went down to the lens corrections and added a vignette so that way it draws your attention into the center where the subject is. And then went down to our calibration again to mess around with the tones, see where we could push things. Since this is a portrait, I did go in and do an adjustment brush selection on the pupils, and then I increased the sharpness and increased the clarity, just a touch of exposure to make those eyes pop. The last thing I did was go in with the spot removal tool and just clean up a few of the blemishes on her skin. Again, here is our starting point with our raw photo, and here is where we ended up with the edit. Basically just turn the lights on, upped all that contrast, up the tones with the saturation, and I really love how this turned out. Kevin, I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for submitting these beautiful portraits. Okay, our next photo comes from Irfan. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Irfan submitted this beautiful photo. Here we've got a subject going down a path, looks like on a mountainside, but it's a field. We've got mountains, we've got a beautiful sky that's well exposed, and we've got all of that beautiful green grass that we're gonna be able to mess with, and I'm really excited to get into this one. Now, the first thing that I noticed about this photo was the watermark on the right side of the horizon. Now, I understand why people do watermarks, I get it why he did this. I just personally am not a fan of watermarks. I feel like they typically will distract me and I'm looking at the watermark and I'm not looking at the photo. So the first thing that I did was go and remove that watermark with the spot removal tool. While I was at it, I wanted to clean up in the foreground a bit of trash or something like that. So I made a few adjustments there to get things cleaned up so that way we're not having too many distractions in this image. Next, I went into the exposure and I brought down those highlights so that way we could retain those beautiful clouds. Brought up the shadows, brought up a bit of the white, dropped the blacks, increased that vibrance a little bit so we get more saturation in the midtones, but then dropped the overall saturation of the image down a little bit. Next, dropped down to the tone curve and I implemented a nice simple S curve, and then I lifted up the blacks, messed a little bit with the midtones so that way I can get the contrast exactly how I wanted with the tone curve. We're already making a pretty big difference in this image so far, so now it's time to mess with the colors. Drop it down to the HSL panel, messed around with those hues, and I really wanted to mess with those greens, so I brought the greens to a bit of a cooler tone, and then I immediately went out and desaturated them, and then I dropped down the yellow and boosted the orange so that way I could get that path to stick out just a little bit more in the image, just because I love the tonality and the different colors there with the contrast. Went over to the luminance, messed around again with my cooler tones, the greens, aquas, blues, subdued them a little bit so that way they weren't popping too much, and then messing around again with those warm tones so there's this nice contrast between the cooler tones and the warmer tones in the image. Continuing with the cool and warm contrast, I went down to the color wheels, brought the warm tones up inside of the midtones, dropped down to more blue tones in the highlights and in the shadows. Then to accentuate that even more, went down to the color calibration and made sure that again we had more of that warm and cool contrast in those primaries. So I'm loving where this photo is going so far. I want to make sure that we're making our subject pop, so went in, added a vignette, and then I wanted to make sure that the subject in the center was popping a bit more, so I did a radial filter and I increased the exposure a little bit so that way we can make that subject pop a little bit more in the center of the frame. Very happy with this photo so far, but the one thing that's still just kind of nagging me is that power line situation. So brought the photo into Photoshop and did a lot of clone stamping so that way we could remove the distraction of the power line and that pole, so that way it doesn't take away from the image and distract, but we're just focusing then on our subject and that beautiful, beautiful mountainscape. Once we took care of the power line, I actually went in and added even more vignette because sometimes you need to add more vignette. Now I think this photo is done, but I want to go back and check out our raw file just to see how far we've come. And here is where we ended up. Much more dramatic, less distractions without the watermark and without the power lines and the trash in the front of the image. And I'm really happy with the way that this came out. Irfan, thank you for submitting this photo. Absolutely love it. I hope you enjoyed the edit. Our last two photos come complimentary of Isaiah Kajumba, aka Izzy Kajumba. He's out of Ventura, California, which is my neck of the woods, and he's one of my favorite photographers. He takes incredible street photography, fashion photography type stuff. You definitely need to check him out. He gave me a couple of really great raw photos that I just can't wait to dive into. We got our first raw file here, which is fashion, LA vibes. It's a whole mood and I'm absolutely loving it. I think the way that I want to take this is in a little bit more of a warmer, sort of like glowing, basking in the sunset kind of vibe. So let's go ahead and check that out. So I noticed that the model is in direct window sunlight, and I know that there's that pattern there. So I wanted to bring that pattern out. So the first thing I did was drop down the highlights. That way we get the texture of whatever it is, the windows, bars, so that way we can see that. Messed a little bit with the shadows, the whites, and the blacks. Just wanted to add a little bit more contrast. Everything was looking a little flat before, but boosting clarity, boosting the dehaze sliders really added a nice touch into the contrast. And again, I wanted to make this a little bit more of a warmer kind of sunset vibe. So went into the white balance, warmed things up just a little bit. Then hopped down to the tone curve, did some subtle S-curve work. Really didn't want to do too much because we'd already come so far and everything was exposed really well before. I just wanted to, again, elevate it a little bit more so it doesn't look too flat. So mess around a lot with the contrast in the midtones. Then I hopped down to the color wheels and I added more warmth inside of the highlights and in the midtones. So that way we can keep with that sort of sunset, warm, basking glow kind of vibes. After that, hopped down to the camera calibration and I was messing around with the primary wheels, just again pushing those tones around just to get it just to the right flavor of warmth that I wanted for the final product of this image. Now I love some of the texture that's going on with the wall behind the model, but there's just a couple of spots I just wanted to get rid of so that way they weren't too distracting. After that, I went in and just did some minor adjustments to the exposure just to get things exactly how I wanted, make sure that things were popping, but not too bright so that way they were blown out. And I think this photo is done. Here we are with the raw file, and here is where we ended up. And I just love the warmer tones, again, like with the direct sunlight shining on him. And I love what came out of this one. And last but not least is this photo that we're going to be wrapping up this video with today. This is so cool, so vibey, so LA, like Mango Street. Absolutely love the posing, the composition, the lines, the grit, the texture. Love everything about this. Can't wait to get into editing it. First thing that I did was go in and I messed with the crop so that way I could get our subject in the center of the frame. I went into the exposure and dropped the whites. I wanted to make this a bit more of a flat, again, kind of a Mango Street type vibe. So dropped the highlights, dropped the whites, boosted the shadows just a touch and dropped the blacks, added a little bit of clarity, and I added texture and dehaze so that way we could get a little bit more of that grit, grunge texture that's in this image. Then drop down to the tone curve, but this time not for exposure. This was for manipulating color. So I went in, gave it a little bit more of a warmer, yellowy, sort of magenta-y kind of vibe to kind of match the grit and the texture and the feel of what's already going on in this image. I went and adjusted the colors even further inside of the HSL panels, dropped the saturation on a lot of things, shifted the hue of the yellow, the orange. I made sure to also desaturate the blues because the blues are picking up a bit inside of the asphalt there, so I didn't want those to be too distracting. And in keeping with the grungy, just vibey stuff, I added in quite a bit of grain because I wanted to add more grit and texture to this image. So let's see where we started with this image. Here we are with our raw photo, and here is where we ended up with the final edit. Again, more of that Mango Street LA vibe, added in more grain, more grit, more texture, and kind of kept it nice and flat and moody. And I absolutely love how this edit came out. Isaiah, I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you for submitting this photo. And there you have it. That is editing your photos. Man, I hope that you enjoyed this video. And if you did enjoy it, if you got value out of it, please add some value right back to this video by hitting that like button, and also subscribe to this channel for more regular content just like this. If you would like to submit some of your very own photos for a future episode of editing your photos, go ahead and send your raw files to zsphotoedits@gmail.com. Make sure to tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how long have you been shooting, and don't forget to leave your Instagram handle so that way I could feature you if your photos get chosen for a future video. Don't forget to check out the links in the description below. I'm gonna link to all the photographers who were featured in this video. Go check them out, go show them some support and some love. Couldn't do this video without them. And while you're also down there, you can check out links to my Lightroom presets. You can check out the links to the music that I use in these videos and all the gear that I use to pull off YouTube content. And I just want to say thanks for watching, and until the next time, my name is Sopak. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.